Hey everyone, I am Magical Hacker, and this is episode number 9 of the Eminence Podcast, the non-CEDH Commander podcast, where I help you in the command zone with your deck building skills, and on the battlefield with your deck piloting skills. This podcast is brought to you by Zethus Soon and the rest of my patrons at patreon.com/magicalhacker. Today's topic, chosen by Zethus Soon, is the question, how do you build a commander deck from 0 cards to 100 cards? Some of us probably start off the format by grabbing one of the pre-constructed decks and using that as our first foray into this format. Personally, I never had even purchased a pre-constructed deck before. I know some of my friends who had, and I would sometimes borrow their deck and play that, but other than that, I would never play a pre-constructed deck. I never bought a pre-constructed deck, so even from the get-go, I was building my own decks as well. And having done that for about 10 years, honestly spending more time building decks than even playing decks, I feel like this is what brings me so much joy in the game of Magic. I mean, just the other day, I built a mono-white Enchantress deck. Why? Just because I wanted to enjoy a little bit of just that action of building the deck. It's just so satisfying to me. I think it's maybe a little bit of my creativity kind of, influencing what I'm finding fun. I like to be productive and artistic and creative, and deck building, it really is an art. And, there's a little bit of a science to it as well, but there really is a lot of art. So, I want to go through with my process. There's a couple of different steps, but I want to go through my process so that you can see what I do, and you can maybe try a few things from it. Maybe you can glean a few things. If you haven't really done a whole lot of deck building yourself for Commander, maybe you can try this as your first attempt. Or maybe you can look at my thing, the way I build decks and say, oh yeah, I totally do it differently. But by thinking about the way that you do it, I now have a better understanding of why I like my way better, right? So those are 3 of the benefits to talking about this. So let's first talk about what I would say is step number 1. And for me, step number 1 is always, I either pick a commander or pick a theme that I want to do. So an example of when I'm picking a commander. When I built my Etali Primal Storm commander deck, that was a situation where I saw the card and I said, I don't know what deck I want to build, but I know I want this to be the commander. So Etali Primal Storm is a 6-mana legendary creature. It's an Elder Dinosaur, costs 4 generic and 2 red. It's a 6/6 creature, and it has 1 ability. Whenever Etali Primal Storm attacks, exile the top card of each player's library. You may cast any number of those spells without paying their mana costs. That's all it says. And I'm doing this from memory, so if I'm slightly off, sorry about that. But one important thing is it doesn't let you play lands. I remember that part. And this is when it attacks specifically. So I looked at Etali and I was like, oh, that is so cool. I get to cast cards from my own deck for free. I get to cast cards from my opponent's decks for free. I mean, this is so me. This is something I love to do. So I was like, perfect, and it's monocolored. I'm a big fan of monocolored commander decks. I think everybody will have a lot of fun if they have about a third of their commander decks being monocolored. Some people need more, some people need less, but monocolored I think is such a untapped potential for fun in the commander format. So I was looking at Etali and I was like, dude, I've got to build this because this is so cool. So I knew what I wanted for the commander, and then I had to figure out the theme from there. I'm like, okay, now what? Now I've got the commander, what do I do with the deck? And so I ended up going into a deck that is built around trying to get extra combats, of course, to get more combat, more abilities from Etali. Things that will allow it to have haste, so that as soon as I play it during my main phase, I can then attack the same turn. That was pretty huge. And so there's a lot of things that were there. And then, of course, when you cast the extra combat spells from Etali's ability, because most of them say, after this main phase, you get an extra combat, because you're casting it in the combat step, they don't do anything. They literally, for whatever reason, the way MTG rules work, when you're casting one of those spells, if it says, after this main phase, and you're not casting it in a main phase, then the rest of the sentence doesn't apply. So you don't get any of that extra benefit. So, swinging with Etali, getting one of these extra combat spells, it just goes to the graveyard, doesn't do anything. So then I had to figure out, okay, now I want to play things that will allow me to bring them back from my graveyard to my hand, or allow me to cast them from my graveyard with flashback, or things along those lines. that allow me to actually get any advantage from revealing extra combat steps with Atali's ability. So that was an example of where I figured out the commander, and then I knew which commander I wanted, and I figured out the theme from that. But then there are some times where it's the opposite, right? First I figure out the theme, and then I try to find a commander that fits it. I've got a lot of examples of this one, but the one that I'm going to talk about is one of the most recent decks that I've built for my personal collection, and that is a Jund Infect deck. So I knew I wanted Jund for the colors of an Infect deck. And I knew I wanted Infect because one of the things that I find a lot of fun too is taking a strategy that people think is not good, or even people are playing it and it actually isn't good, right? It's literally not good. Taking a theme or a deck like that and then trying to figure out how I can make it better, how I can make it go from not good to making it to be good. And Jund Infect, or specifically Infect in this situation, was an example of that. So I was thinking, okay, Infect. Some people think it's really good, very powerful. But then when you look at the way it wins, it typically doesn't win a whole lot. It's pretty low power in terms of win rate. Pretty high power in terms of how many people it can kill and how quickly it can kill people. But in terms of winning the games, yeah, it doesn't happen all that often. Pretty low amount of the time. And so I had to take a step back and think about why is that, and I think people are trying to play Infect in Commander the same way they would play Infect in Modern. And in my opinion, I think those are two totally different environments. You've got to completely change your approach when you're trying to do Infect in Commander. And so this was kind of like a prime opportunity for me to have something that I could build and really pour my creative energy into and figure out how to make it work, how to make it more likely to win the game. So that's what I wanted to do with Infect. And so in this situation, I'm thinking, okay, I know I want this theme, but what commander do I pick, right? It's like, I don't know. There's not really a Jund-colored commander that's for Infect. Especially that when it comes to Infect, if you sit down at the table and people find out really quickly that you're playing that Infect deck, they're like, oh my gosh, we've got to take this person out. Again, it goes back to the idea that it's very scary, but it doesn't win a lot. So people tend to get rid of Infect because, again, they could die very quickly to Infect. But with my deck, I didn't want to try to kill people as quickly as possible because I knew I could set up a situation where I could put a lot of energy, but the more I had, in terms of potential energy, the more my kinetic energy could be. So if I could build up that potential energy so that when I did spend it all as kinetic energy in the game, I could then take out multiple opponents, and so it would make me a little bit more protected from dying as a result of starting that process of starting to defeat opponents. So that was my approach with Infect. What did I pick as my commanders? Well, I knew I wanted something that would help me with my Infect creatures. There's a lot of things that I could have looked for. I could have looked for a haste enabler. That's pretty important in this kind of design of my Infect deck. I could look for something that increases the power and toughness, or specifically just the power, whether it's through a damage doubler or through something that gives it a big buff. I could look for things that make creatures unblockable. That's another big thing. But what I chose to go for was that second one. I chose to go for something that would give me a lot of damage output. Jeska Thrice Reborn is a mono red commander that has partner. So I can partner it up with something else. So I chose to partner it up with Ikra Shadiki, which is a black and green legendary creature that has partner. So I've got that mono red planeswalker, Jeska Thrice Reborn, and Ikra Shadiki. So the way these two work as the commanders for that deck is that Jeska, I can use her 0 ability to make it so that I'm tripling the damage output from one of my attacking Infect creatures. And then Ikra Shadiki, if I have it on the battlefield, I can also get life back. So if I'm attacking and I'm dealing enough damage to kill someone, then hopefully I've got enough toughness on the creatures that dealt damage so that I can gain a good bit of life back so that I won't be as easy to kill, after I start to defeat my opponents. So that's the perspective. So far, it's been working great. I really have been enjoying this deck. It's been a lot more effective as an Infect deck, and surprisingly, because I'm not trying to implement my game plan super quickly, everybody does get a chance to play, and so I haven't seen a single person that's been salty about this Infect deck, which I thought was pretty surprising. I knew going into it that I was probably going to have some people who, no matter what, if you win with Infect, they're going to be upset. But in practice, it's been the opposite experience. Everybody has been saying, hey, that's a cool Infect deck. I'm kind of extrapolating here. I enjoyed playing with you because I didn't lose before I had a chance to do anything, and so that's been a kind of a refreshing experience for me. So again, either pick the commander and then figure out what theme you're gonna do, or pick the theme and then figure out which commander fits it. And that's the first step for me. I always do that first because I feel like if you don't do that, you can really get yourself pulled down multiple pathways where I don't pick the commander, I don't pick the theme, or I don't, do one of those two things. And so suddenly I'm getting pulled in all these different directions. Like, okay, what about this commander? What about that commander? Or I get pulled down too many different themes. I've got a commander and I'm trying to do 5 or 7 different things in the deck, and nothing is really efficient. And so, yeah, you can get pulled down multiple ways if you don't do both of those two things first. Pick the commander, pick the theme. Okay. After that, before I even look at any other cards, and sometimes I look at cards to get an idea of how I want to do this, but in terms of deciding which cards are guaranteed to go into the deck, before I decide any of that, I create a skeleton. I create an outline where of the remaining 99 or 98 cards, if you're playing a partner-like combination where you have 2 commanders, I look at the rest of the 98 or 99 cards. I allocate 62 of those. Is it 62? No, I think it's 64. No, 63. That's what it was. I allocate 63 slots to non-lands and the remaining cards to lands. So, of those 63 cards, I know I need a couple of things. First off, I know I'm going to need some card draw. So I set aside 9 spots of those remaining 63. I set 9 away for card draw. Now, if my commander is doing drawing, then I'll set just 5 aside because I feel like I don't need to have all that many slots because the commander is doing that. And I can't rely on the commander every time, so I've got to have some in the deck, but I need to have a balance. So I play about half, a little bit over half in terms of card draw. I also set aside 9 slots for ramp. And again, if the commander is doing ramping as well, then I'll set only 5 slots aside. One thing to note here so far about the card draw and the ramp, there are some specific particularities of what type of card draw and what type of ramp that I look for. We will definitely be talking about these types of things in future episodes. What kind of card draw is good versus bad, what kind of ramp is good versus bad. And so we'll be doing that with all of these categories here. But the next category, the third category, I definitely make sure I have is spot removal. So I'm looking for at least 4 slots for spot removal. One thing to mention, with card draw and ramp, I did set aside 9 slots each to those. But if I'm playing a deck where, the deck is built around one of those, so for example, if I'm playing a treasure-based deck, I have a Sultai-colored treasure deck. If you're counting the treasure-making cards as ramp, then I've got way more than 9 cards in the deck that produce treasures. So I can go up in number if it's for the theme, but I'd like to stay at that number unless I've got a commander that's doing it, and that's the only reason I would change it. But in terms of spot removal, I say 4. If my deck is, let's say, a control deck, that number might go up to 8 or 12 or a different number. I'm trying to say I want at least 4. I'm not going to go below 4, but I'll definitely include 4. One thing to note here about spot removal, if I'm playing blue, which has counter spells, 2 of those spot removal slots will instead be counter spells. Because 1-for-1s are necessary. You definitely need to have 1-for-1 cards in your deck where someone's about to combo off. You've got to be able to either counter a spell or destroy, a permanent that they've got, exile a permanent that they've got out in the battlefield. So those are important. You definitely need to have those in Commander. But you don't want to have a bunch of those because each time you play them, it is a little bit of card disadvantage within the multiplayer environment. So if I'm playing a card like, let's give an example of Swords to Plowshares. If I'm playing it on player A, and opponent A, they have a creature, and I play that Swords to Plowshares on their creature, player A is down a card, they lost their creature, and I'm down a card, I lost my swords, and now players B and C are both relative to the two of us. The two of them are now up a card, and so 1-for-1s are necessary, but they're not ideal. So we want to have 4. I mean, there might be times where I'd want to go up, but I don't want to go below that. Otherwise, I find myself too weak to a combo situation where somebody could combo off and there's not much I can do to stop it. Next up, board wipes. I want to have 4 of these as well. And similar to the spot removal, if I'm playing a color that has options for destroying all permanents, and because that's in colorless, that's every color combination, I want to make sure that I'm playing 2 effects that can do that. Trying to go for 2 effects that can also, in addition to getting rid of creatures, can also get rid of artifacts and or enchantments and or planeswalkers. That's going to be really important for the board wipe section. But then the other 2 cards, I've got to have at least 2 cards that are very low CMC, like 4 mana or less. Because there are times where I'll need to do something early on in the game, and so I want to make sure I have options for that. So at least 2 of those board wipes have to be low CMC, and at least 2 of those board wipes, if possible, have to be getting rid of card types in addition to just creatures. So that's the board wipes that I'm playing. So those are kind of the 4 big ones where I have numbers assigned to them. 9 card draw, 9 ramp, 4 spot removal / counter spells, and 4 board wipes. But I've also got 2 additional categories that I'll want to play, but the amount of cards that I'll play it just depends on the color combination. And so the first one I'd like to talk about is tutors. Tutors, of course, are very powerful in Commander. When you're playing a 100 card deck, technically a 99 card deck, and everything's singleton, tutors can really make sure that you get what you need when you need it. And so that's one benefit to tutors. But it depends on the color combination. If I'm playing mono red, am I forcing myself to play gamble? No, I'm not. I don't. If I don't need to have the gamble, I'm not playing the gamble. But there are some tutors that, in my opinion, are so good, you really can't say that your deck is better without running them. And for me, I limit it to any tutor that costs less than 2 mana per card that you're tutoring, if it's like super important to the game plan. So for example, Vampiric Tutor costs 1 mana, it's an instant. It tutors any card. I mean, there's no black deck that won't want to tutor any card. So Vampiric Tutor is in literally all my black decks. There is one exception, I'll talk about that in a second here. So it's in almost literally all of my black decks. Same thing with Demonic Tutor, 2 mana for a card that does the same thing. So those 2 are black spells that are going to be tutoring any card. Enlightened Tutor, sometimes Mystical Tutor, sometimes Worldly Tutor. These are examples of cards that they're just so good, so low CMC. I feel like I have to play them. I don't have a choice. And so that's where the tutors come into play. There are some other cards that other people really like. Diabolic Tutor is a very commonly used one. For me, I don't want to be playing a whole bunch of tutors. I do like the singleton aspect. It does make me have fun in games. And I've been able to convince myself that paying 4 mana for a tutor, while it may be good, may be powerful, it's not way more powerful than just me playing another card in my deck. So do I want to pay 4 mana for a cantrip if that cantrip is the best possible card in my deck? Some people might say yes. Personally, I say no. So that's my perspective. I'm limiting myself to, I don't want to play a bunch of tutors. I just want to play a few. So instead, I'll only play the tutors that are so low in mana cost that I can play them. I'm sure there's other ones too. Another good example of a card that maybe the first card you're using it on might be more than 2 mana, but over time, as you continue to use that card over and over, you'll get more out of it, is Fauna Shaman or Survival of the Fittest. Those are 2 cards that are doing similar things. I'm surprised that Fauna Shaman isn't called Magus of the Survival, because that certainly does feel like it. But anyways, that's a off-topic thing. So anyways, those 2 are cards where if I'm playing a deck that has a lot of creatures and I need to have specifically some creatures, I'm already playing that Worldly Tutor, yeah, I'll go for those 2 because it's so easy to use those to get what I need to get. So I put here max tutors. I mentioned there's one exception. When I have a deck that has 5 colors, there are so many cards that I would say, I've got to play all of these, that there's just not room for all of them. So So I can't be playing everything. So in those situations, I have a 5-color deck that would really love to get, for example, it has a creature in there that it really wants, because it's a 5-color Super Friends deck. It really wants to get Deep Glow Skate, which is a 5 mana creature that enters the battlefield and doubles the number of counters on each of any number of target permanents. And so it would love to get that creature, but because there's so many other things that's going on in that deck, I might not be playing that Fauna Shaman, or I might not be playing the Worldly Tutor, right? I might think, okay, it's good, but it's not worth. I don't have enough slots for it. So when it comes to 5-color deck, the Hosers and the Tutors, those get kind of dropped down below max. Otherwise, I do play max Tutors. And again, the next category here is max Hosers. Max Hosers, there's a lot of different things that fall into this category. Some people are familiar with the term Hosers. Some people are not. So let me explain to you why I'm using this as the nomenclature here, so that we can be on the same page. Some people will look at these cards and say, oh, those are stacks cards. And the reason I'm not a fan of using the stacks nomenclature is because I feel like it's at the point now where stacks means different things to different people, so using it is likely to cause miscommunication. And I want to avoid miscommunication. Obviously, I'm talking on a podcast. Miscommunication is a big deal for me. I don't want that to be the case. So in that situation, instead, I'm going to use a word that I think describes it still really well without causing confusion. So I've used the word Hosers, and maybe it's because of the way that I learned how to play the game, but when we heard about a card that would, make a particular type of deck not able to do its thing, we would say that card hoses that deck. And so I've applied that to these cards, and I say, okay, these are hosing things, so they're Hosers. So that's what I call them. What falls into this category? Neo Tuck cards. So Tuck used to be a thing that you could do to get rid of problematic commanders in a more permanent sense. There are some cards now that still work that way. The 4 cards that do that, in my opinion, and while there are other cards that do it, I have some major issues with. But the 4 cards I do like are Darksteel Mutation, Imprison in the Moon, Song of the Dryads, and Oubliette. Those are the 4 that I like for this category of Neotuck. We've also got things that stop tutoring. So Aven Mind Sensor, Opposition Agent, Ashiok Dreamrender, and Stranglehold are the 4 that I like in those situations. There are some other cards. Extract, I'm a big fan of. I like Curse of Exhaustion. I like Confounding Conundrum. These are some Hosers that I'm a big fan of. I've got a list of Hosers that I really like. Maybe I'll tackle it in another podcast, but I like Hosers. I think they help put a deck that's not going to be as powerful as others. It puts it on the same playing field as the other more powerful decks by finding the weakness to those really powerful decks, targeting that weakness with some cards to make it so that the deck cannot function as strongly as it would be able to otherwise. So I play that. Now, after I've got my 9 card draw, my 9 ramp, my 4 spot removal / counter spells, my 4 board wipes, my max number of tutors, my max number of Hosers, then the rest of the non-lands can be whatever I want. So let's say I've got maybe 3 or 4, let's say 4 Hosers, and I've got 2 tutors. That would be 6 plus 4, that's 10 plus 4, that's 14, plus 18, that's going to be 32. So of my 63 slots, 32 are designed here already. They're already set in there. So that leaves me with 31 cards that I can design however I want. That's not including lands. And on top of that, there are some ramp spells that are also going to count as lands too. And we'll get into that in a later topic, later episode as well. But I've got basically 31, 32, 33, something like that, number of non-land slots in that deck. So I've got my first step, picking the commander or the theme. Second step, picking the other one. If I pick the commander, I pick the theme. If I pick the theme, I pick the commander. So first 2 steps, get the commander and the theme down. Step number 3, build a skeleton, starting off with these, what I would call staples. And then the next step is to fill out the rest of the skeleton with your non-staples. What is your theme doing? Decide on what things you want to do with the rest of your deck, and then design the skeleton that way before you even start looking at cards. Why is this super, super important? Because if I'm building any theme and I don't have a skeleton, I could put 200 cards easy in a deck like that. Because there are so many things that are so good in every theme. And we've got so many cards in Magic now that I could build 3 singleton decks that share no cards with each other, that are doing the same thing with 3 different commanders, and the 99s completely differently. Like, that's how easy it is to build a deck now. It's impossible to find the perfect card for it unless you decide ahead of time what you're actually going to be putting in your deck. So that's the idea now. We want to then design the rest of the skeleton with what we want. Do I want 5 token doublers? All right, and then I want to have 12 things that create treasures. And then I want to have, and you're going through each one of these things. I want to have this, I want to have that, I want to have this. This is how many of them I want. And then once you've got that skeleton, then you go and fill in the deck. And you can adjust the skeleton after that. You don't have to set it in stone. If later on you find, I did say I wanted 5 token doublers, but now that I think about it, I think I want just 4. Or maybe I want 6, because I found that there's 6 token doublers, and I really do want all 6 of them. And whatever the case may be, you can adjust the skeleton, but it's important to have that skeleton first. One life lesson that I've learned for myself is 2 things are important. 1, always try to have a plan. And 2, always try to be flexible. If you're just planning and you're not flexible, you will miss out on opportunities that would be super helpful for you. And again, this is in any area of life. If you're just flexible but you have no plan, you will be spending too much time on trying to figure out what to do when you don't have the time to do it. So it's better to spend that energy, spend that time ahead of those situations and have a plan. At least you can be flexible after that, but you've got that plan that you're going to be going with. Once you've got all that done, you've got this deck, the last step that I do, and I recommend to everybody to do this, you take that deck list, first thing you do, put it into EDHREC. I learned this the hard way. Sometimes I'll build a deck, go straight to playing it, and I'm like, how did I forget? And that was the sound of me hitting my forehead. I'm doing a facepalm here. How did I forget that one really good card? I think a good example of this is when I was building Etali Primal Storm. I think my first build forgot to have Strionic Resonator in it, which is an artifact that you can activate to copy target triggered ability. So of course, Etali's got a triggered ability. Copying it is amazing. How could I forget Strionic Resonator? I may be off my story, but it definitely has happened multiple times where this super obvious card that would be amazing in a deck, I totally forgot to look it up to include it. So plug in your deck list into EDHREC and see, am I missing anything that's super, super good? Because then you can look through and say, oh, I like this card. I wish I had included that one. And then you can have a list of cards that you'd like to have. And then you can go back to your skeleton, adjust the numbers to allow those cards to be slotted in, or, as is the case most of the time with me, look at your skeleton and say, you know what, I did forget those cards, but the cards that I have right now, they're still more important than those cards. So I did forget about them, but that's okay. They're still not good enough to warrant a slot in my deck. And then once you've got that, you're done. You've built your deck from 0 all the way up to 100. So that's the way that I build my decks, and maybe you do a different way, but that's just my opinion. I'm definitely interested to hear your thoughts as well. Do you agree with me, or do you disagree, and why? Feel free to leave me a comment at youtube.com/magicalhackermtg or a tweet at twitter.com/magical__hacker. If you want to pick the topic for an episode of the Eminence podcast, just like Zethus soon, check out patreon.com/magicalhacker. In fact, the question for the next episode will be, should the Mulligan rules of Magic be changed? Thank you again to Zethus Sun. Thank you to all of my patrons, and thank you for listening. Stay awesome, everybody.